Hello, everybody. My name is Laura Roussel, Director of School Services at NIET. And in this time of uncertainty, wondering where we should focus our efforts in continuing to lead cluster is the answer right now, especially since the ultimate purpose for clusters, our professional learning communities, is to support teachers in their teaching and learning efforts. Now more than ever, teachers need the support as they transition to virtual classrooms across the nation. Well, I'm excited to be here with you today to talk a little bit about this topic right now and share some tips with you on how you might make that transition to virtual clusters or your professional learning communities with your teachers. And I'm especially excited to have three fellow master teachers from two of our Louisiana partners joining our conversation today. They are boots on the ground, sleeves rolled up right now in this work. First, we're going to talk to Amy Crain, who's a master teacher in Ascension Public Schools at Lakeside Primary in Louisiana. Also, we're going to talk to Ronda Johnson, who's also a master teacher in Jefferson Parish Schools at Myrtle C. Thibodaux in Louisiana. And also Natalie Klibert, a master teacher in Jefferson Parish Schools at John Q. Adams Middle School. So thank y'all for being here today. Thank you. Well, I'm really excited about what we'll be able to do today. The first thing we're going to talk about as we think about transitioning to virtual cluster meetings is really thinking about the questions that we need to think about. What are the needs of ourselves as teacher leaders as we make this transition? And then also, what are the needs of our teachers? And then we're going to offer some very practical and applicable tips for really making that transition to those virtual clusters. And then I'd like to leave you with a little closing note. So the main thing that we want you to get out of this webinar is the ability to just explore some practical and applicable ways on how you might begin to plan for virtual clusters. And really remembering that clusters are there to meet the needs of both your teachers and your students, especially during this time as we respond to COVID-19. So, a lot of educators across the nation are really concerned right now with making sure that their students are taken care of, their families are taken care of, which is exactly where we should be. And they wonder, should we really be thinking about clusters right now? And I would say that right now, as our teachers are trying to figure out this virtual teaching and learning for themselves, it's more important than ever that we help them figure this out. And that's the purpose of clusters and professional learning communities. That's where we really support teachers in their efforts, no matter if we're in a brick and mortar building or if we're virtual. And so they're having to navigate a new normal. And it's so important that now more than ever, we help them navigate that normal with these structures that we know work. And so I think that with the right plan, we can make clusters beneficial and helpful and meaningful for teachers right now in these uncharted waters. And I know Natalie, Amy, and Rhonda, as we begin to talk about this, you'll have lots to share in regards to how you've been helping teachers in these uncharted waters as they sort of dive into this new way of teaching. So I want to go ahead and get started. If you're a teacher leader right now and you're thinking about, I need to make this move into transitional clusters because all of my teachers right now are leading virtual classrooms. It's first important to think about the barriers that you might experience as a teacher leader, as someone who is going to be supporting teachers in this manner. And so, let's talk a little bit about that as we think about some common barriers that we might be experiencing. So Rhonda, I'm gonna go ahead and let you get started. As a teacher leader, what might be some common barriers that we might experience when we're thinking about making this transition?
So for me, just as a teacher leader, one of the things that I had to make sure that I can address that could be a barrier is being able to support teachers with the use of technology on different platforms. So for me, teachers are at varying differences in terms of where they are with technology, and sometimes trying to support that through virtually is kind of difficult. So it's been challenging at times where, of course, we have to get on the phone or Zoom and they share screens so that I can make sure that I'm supporting them in the best way that they need. So in instances, if there are challenges in terms of me making sure that I am well-versed on technology.
Yeah, exactly. Just learning the technology platforms for ourselves can be a barrier or can be a need that we have as teacher leaders. Amy, what about you? What are some things that you feel might be common barriers for teacher leaders, or something that you have felt has been a common barrier for you?
I think as teacher leaders, it's important that we recognize and know how to address the needs of our teachers. You know, knowing where all of our teachers stand as far as what's happening in their homes, and knowing their level of anxiety. Do we have teachers who are trying to school their own children while teaching other children? Do we have teachers who are dealing with lost jobs in their families, who are dealing with illness? So I think it's important that we remain aware of what's going on with our teachers as we are kind of tasked with leading from the middle. It's important that as we go down to teachers and give them the information that's coming from our districts and from our schools, that we also are super aware of how we need to approach those teachers based on the needs that they have and based on what they're experiencing in their lives.
Yeah, that's a great connection, Amy. Sometimes whenever we know we have a mission, we can just move forward with that mission without realizing that we need to maybe think about where our teachers are. And that can be a barrier for us because, you know, we're very goal oriented. Many of us are very goal oriented and we want to get it done. But thinking about where our teachers really are, we won't be able to pick up with a virtual cluster where we left off when we were face to face. And so it's going to be really important that we think about that. And there are many other barriers that teacher leaders are dealing with, you know, from technology barriers to just figuring out where my teachers are and do they even really want to engage in this type of learning right now during this time. And, you know, another question I think it's important for us to ask as teacher leaders is how should our clusters or our professional learning communities look? How are they different and how are they the same? And so, you know, at first, when you think about it, you think they're going to be so different. But Amy, when I was talking to you the other day, you had an aha moment on really thinking about this question about the differences and the similarities between clusters.
Yes, so I was leading a cluster with some of my teachers, and we were sharing some of the barriers and some of their struggles, and they talked about having trouble just figuring out exactly what to hone in and teach in a very limited amount of time that they had to make videos for students. So trying to figure out which lessons they were going to teach, how are they going to adjust the rigor of what they're used to doing in the classroom to this online platform. And it really made me realize that the processes that I use as a teacher leader should really be the same. You know, I should be going through these same processes alongside them or even before them to dig through their curriculum to figure out what are the essential lessons that need to be taught, what are those important skills, and how are we going to take all of that information and present it in a virtual lesson for kids that's still rigorous but also appropriate for the way that we're learning right now. And so I really kind of recognized, wait a second, it's not really different from the work that we do. It's different work, but we go through some of the same processes that, you know, we do go through normally in the classroom setting.
Yeah, I loved that because I think we can, because we're entering this new territory, we can think that it's different. And we forget that, you know, this structure can happen in a virtual modality or it can happen face to face, but we're here to go first and to support our teachers. And that's what hasn't changed. And so really keeping that in mind as we think about, you know, what are our needs as teacher leaders when we make this transition? I want to think about the next question that I think is really important as we make this transition from face-to-face meetings, teacher support to virtual teacher support. It's really about assessing the teacher needs. That question that I asked earlier is, you know, is it really important for us to think about leading these clusters and these teacher meetings? And we said, yes, it is. If we're here to support them, this is what we should be doing. But we also have to recognize that they have a lot on their plate right now and they have a lot going on. And so in order for these clusters to really be meaningful for them, it's important for us to think about what are their biggest needs? What are they facing right now? And so Natalie, talk a little bit about some of the things that, you know, you've noticed that your teachers are facing right now, or some of the things that they're struggling with.
So this has evolved a little bit over the first couple of weeks of quarantine, but it started out with the teachers having this big need to get in touch with their students. They were really worried about their students. And that first week, we're having a lot of difficulty even contacting them. So that started with one of the biggest teacher needs. Also, we are not a big technology district. We're definitely not in one-to-one capability with the students either. And so some of my teachers couldn't even access their email at home versus at work. And so, the teacher need of training them on technology. And then as we've started to conquer some of that, the biggest need now is holding the students accountable for starting to complete some of this work that we're assigning to them on the online platforms.
Awesome. And so really helping them to figure out how they're going to address those needs, and without you being engaged with them in these clusters, you wouldn't know what their needs are. I mean, you're experiencing this each week as you meet with them virtually and talk to them. Rhonda, what are some needs that you think teachers are facing right now as they begin to, transition to this virtual teaching and learning?
So just adding to what Natalie said, of course, we're in the same district, so we have the same issue with technology not quite being where it needed to be as we made this transition. So with us at my particular school, a lot of our teachers are having issues with students even completing the work or signing up for Google Classroom. So some of the things that I've had to coach teachers around is really just reaching out to parents and walking them through the process, because they might send an email, but that might not communicate the way that parents needed to be communicated in order for them to access the platforms. And even having an Android, some parents, that's all they have is their phone to get onto whatever platform, and it works differently. So that's been a challenge, for us, because I'm supporting mostly Apple products. I'm sorry to say, but so it's an issue even with an Android because it looks different in terms of how they log on. But I've literally had to walk teachers through to model for them how they need to walk their parents through so that we can get the numbers up. It helped to have the virtual parent meetings that we had, but even with that, when you think about the number of our students, we have 300 students, and we probably maybe had 60 parents. So, I mean, we're just not able to reach all of our students, but that's an issue even when we're face to face. So that is definitely an issue that we're going to make sure that we address, going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that you've been face to face with teachers before in cluster meetings or in professional learning communities. And even when we're face to face, if we don't address the most pressing need, it's easy to check out. And so now more than ever, this need is not just important, it's critical right now, and it's clouding their minds. And so if we bring them into a virtual cluster and we talk about something that's not at the tip of their mind right now, it's not going to be easy for them to engage. And so really thinking about what are their biggest needs right now, and that is where we start. Starting with their needs is how we begin to support them, and slowly supporting them through that each week or each time we meet with them, taking them through solutions to those needs. So those are the two overarching questions that I really wanted us to think about. Really, what are our needs as teacher leaders, and what are the needs of our teachers? And this second question on here, really, how can we address the most pressing needs through virtual clusters? And that's really what I want to talk about right now. I want to dive into that as we talk through these tips for leading virtual cluster meetings. Just 4 simple, applicable tips that I think is something that all teacher leaders really, if they thought about right now, would help them get this up and running. And so just a quick preview of what the tips that we're going to talk about are. Really just tip 1 is picking the right technology platform. As many of your teachers have moved to virtual platforms with their students, we too, as teacher leaders, want to also move to that virtual platform. And I think it's important for you to be a part of thinking, what should this virtual platform look and sound like? If your teachers are using a virtual platform already, maybe that's the one that you should use as you think about going first. But that's really going to be the first thing we think about. Tip 2 is just something that we just got finished talking about, which is when you're making that transition to virtual clusters, you want to make sure that you're addressing the most pressing needs first, and that you continue as the needs change and develop, address those needs. And tip 3 is you don't want to make this an event that's all by itself, where teachers are checking it off of a list. You want to make sure that you're engaging after that cluster meeting in follow-up and support. You want to make this a story for them, not just one page in the book. And then tip number 4 is really about establishing norms as you move from face-to-face PLCs, or as you have been in face-to-face now to virtual. There are some new norms that you have to think about as you move teachers into this collaboration. So these are the tips that we're going to talk about. We're going to go into detail about each one. So let's go ahead and start off with tip number 1. Picking the right technology platform. And as I said earlier, you probably want to be very, very familiar with the platform that your school is using. Many teacher leaders probably worked very closely with the teachers and administrators in being a part of this decision. But really, I want to make it simple. Your technology platform is just that. It's a way for you to communicate with your teachers. And that first bullet there, something that allows you to hear your teachers, see your teachers, and interact with your teachers is a great way to start. I have some examples here that you can check out, several examples, and many of these virtual platform examples are offering extended trial periods right now, free services, but it's just important for you to think about which of these might work best. Thinking about where you will be able to see both the teachers and have a way to maybe collaborate and share student work, communicate with them, and then also thinking about which of these might be consistent for the teachers. If they've been given the charge of using one of these in particular, how as we as teacher leaders can use this to go first. So Amy, I'm going to go ahead and start with you real quick. Talk to me a little bit about what kind of information or what platform you used and what helped you to make that decision whenever you chose that platform.
So all of our teachers, K-5, set up Google Classrooms for their students. Some of our upper grades were familiar with Google Classrooms, some of our lower grades not so much. And so for each cluster group, I created a Google Classroom where I could, attempt to at least model how to organize content for students, how to make it easy for them to access through different topics, through different types of assignments, how to clean up the stream on the Google Classroom, and just how to communicate so that you can maybe check in with your students through Google Classroom. And so it was good for me to, kind of going back to what I said first, to try to go through that process first so that I can help them troubleshoot when they had issues with their Google Classrooms, but also to help them see a model of how they could set it up so that it's clean and easy for their students and for their parents to access.
Awesome. Great. So I think it's just important, you used that if our goal right now in leading clusters and professional learning communities is to support our teachers, then using the platform that they've been asked to use to help organize them is a great way to be a leader right now and to lead the way for them. Okay, so Rhonda, what are some, or Natalie, either of you, what are some ways that you have established what platform you might be using with your teachers?
We initially started using Zoom because that's what the district had used for us with PDs, and I was familiar with it. But like Amy, we started rolling out the Google Classrooms as well. And the students and the teachers already had access to Google Classroom and Google Meets through their Google Suite. And so the teachers had kind of expressed interest in using Google Meets because they wanted to start doing classes that way with their students. So then we went through the process of transitioning to Google Meets through Cluster so they could then roll that out with their kids.
Yeah, good. So again, just using real simple, what are they using already? So that's great. And I mean, thinking about the different things that they'll be doing and incorporating that into your virtual clusters. If they're going to be using a chat tool, if they're going to be using a polling tool, thinking about what that looks and sounds like as you're going first in your cluster meetings. Okay, good. So that's tip number 1. Tip number 1 is real simple. You want to choose a platform that you can really engage with your teachers virtually. And just keeping in mind that, this is really about the learning and the support that you are providing them more than the technology platform. So if you get stuck, I would recommend a good old-fashioned phone call or a FaceTime or jump into a Google Doc together. Just making sure that we're not getting too bogged down with the platforms right now, keeping our sights on what matters, and that is you are there to support your teachers. So I want to move on to tip number 2. I think this is going to be extremely critical. After you've selected your platform and you've made a good decision about how you want to communicate with your teachers, I think it's most important for you to understand where your teachers are so that you can address the most pressing need. And these are some of the needs that we brainstormed at the very beginning as teachers initially started to transition to virtual teaching and learning. So I want to talk a little bit about, take yourself back a few weeks as you began this journey. And what were some things that you really had to think about first as you were addressing the most pressing needs? I know teachers are worried about their students. They're worried about how their students are being supported. Teachers are worried about how they're going to transition to virtual teaching. And we also have our teachers at home who may have family members who are sick, who may have children at home. And so, Natalie, would you get us started with talking about how you may have used your clusters in the beginning to address these most pressing needs?
Sure. So week 1, right off the bat, we definitely started with how are teachers feeling? And so to gather that information, I kind of just made a quick little 6-question sheet, and we called it Where I Am Now. And it asked them things like, how are you doing personally? In regards to work, students and families they were able to get in touch with and those they could not. How many students were completing the assignments that they were posting so far, and then just any big needs that we needed to be aware of. And so I set up a Google Classroom for my cluster, just like Amy did as well, and I made this an assignment, and they submitted it through the assignments. And just some things that came out of this was there was a resounding need for more training in Google Classroom because they had never had that at school before. And so that led to the next 2 weeks of cluster. I knew that I needed to get back into that and deal with that.
Excellent. So something as simple as just having them answer these questions, letting you know where they were, and allowed you to sort of figure out what those next steps are. Great.
Yeah, and we revisit that again actually this upcoming week in cluster, so they can kind of see how far we have come in the last 3 weeks, and they can kind of feel good about they've had some success in places, then we can look at next steps again.
Oh, that's great. So using it as a tracker too.
Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, Rhonda, what are some ways that you've really thought about addressing the most pressing needs for your teachers in your clusters?
So essentially just making sure that cluster continues to be relevant to what actually teachers and students need. I use Padlet a lot with teachers in the classroom when we're in cluster, just to kind of get a feel for what the takeaway is that they got from cluster, what continued support they need outside of cluster. But it's ironic that even after we've been doing this now for about 3 weeks with the virtual clusters, the teachers are now creating their Padlets for teachers to communicate, which is good. So they're throwing out questions like, how is Google Classroom going with your class? What are some things you've been doing that has been working? So it's good to see that even though we can't collaborate in the way that we were used to collaborating, that they're actually taking it on the ownership of doing it for the school. So that's been interesting to see that they are doing that. So I usually use that platform to try to figure out where do we go next, because it's important to support students, but I want to make sure that teachers are ready to go back whenever we do return to school so that we can hit the ground running. So this is like vital time.
That's right, exactly. So you're not losing any time, sounds like. And so really supporting teachers to transition to that virtual teaching and have the same continuous conversations that you were having when you were face-to-face, even now as you think about virtual teaching and learning. Amy, what are some things that you have used Cluster in the last few weeks to address your teachers' most pressing needs?
So one of our original, issues is kind of similar to Natalie and Rhonda, similar and different. So we are a little different in our district, is that we do have a lot of one-to-one capabilities. And so when we began, it was super important for us to figure out which students were able to take home devices, who was not able to get a device, could we possibly get devices into those households? And then we also had to look at which students maybe didn't even have access to the internet and how we could address those needs. So that was some of our first things that we addressed in our early clusters were what's going on with our students, who do we need to provide support to when it came to technology, because we knew we would be moving into this virtual schooling within a couple of weeks. And now that we are delivering new learning virtually, we spend a lot of the first part of our clusters talking about who's turning in work, who is not turning in work, what has contact been like with those students, sending in names to administration to help support with contacting those households, just to, as much as possible, get those kids engaged in the work so that we don't, show up next year having lost any ground with our students.
Excellent. So I'm hearing that, clusters really becomes a great way to analyze and receive information. The leadership team is thinking about what teachers are saying, and you can become a great communicator to figure out what some next steps are in regards to how you need to support teachers across the school. Excellent. Okay, so I know that your teachers have grown tremendously as you have addressed those preliminary needs, and they will continue to grow. I want to move on to tip 3. I think tip 3 can be easily forgotten as we're trying to figure out how to first create a virtual platform, and then now what are we going to talk about in our clusters and making sure we're addressing the most pressing need. I think if we get caught up in just worrying about that moment in time, that 30 minutes that we're meeting with them or that 60 minutes that we're meeting with them, we're really going to drop the ball. So tip number 3, I think, is just really, really important. And that's making sure that we're engaging in some type of follow-up and support beyond the meeting. We don't want this to feel like a checklist for teachers. We don't want this to feel like an event, but really thinking about how we can provide follow-up and support. When you're in the brick and mortar buildings, you're actually walking to a classroom to provide follow-up support. But without being able to walk to a classroom to provide follow-up support, I'd love to hear how maybe each of you are thinking about ways that you're engaging in that follow-up and support with your teachers.
So for me, the biggest thing has been to keep the lines of communication with teachers open. So a lot of times, what you have to adjust to is that the support may not look like instructional only support, because there are so many other moving parts to the things that are happening. We've had several staff members that have been impacted in their family by someone being ill or losing someone close to the family. So, support is, of course, primarily focused around instruction, but sometimes it extends beyond that. So, you have built a rapport with your teachers, and that's the main thing. The human element of what we do cannot be left out, especially at this time. So just knowing your teachers and knowing what they need and being comfortable enough to communicate outside of us being on our virtual cluster, and I'm just able to say, hey, let me just call and check in separately from the meeting that we've had where we're all together.
Yeah, I love that, Rhonda. It's important for us to follow up with the content that we're talking about, but clusters and professional learning communities keep us all connected, and it's important for us to continue that connection. I know, Natalie, you had talked a little bit about that communication that you're talking about, and you had shared this teacher communication log as part of your follow-up. Talk a little bit about that.
Okay, so we rolled this out in week 1. When I got the Where Are You Now sheets, I realized there were a lot of students that we still hadn't contacted. Out of 538 kids, week 1, we roughly had about 60 kids on IXL and our different online platforms. So we had the teachers fill out this teacher communication log, and they turned it in. And so then the ILT team was able to look at it and see who still was not able to be contacted. And we devised a plan to contact those other kids and families. And then the teachers are now turning these in on Fridays so that we can ensure that the contact remains open, the communication remains open between the school and the families and the students. And then the second little piece of follow-up that we had was, I told you that technology was a big issue, and there were many different levels of understanding in technology. So for instance, in my ELA cluster, my teachers there are more Google Classroom proficient. Some of them were using this already in the classroom. And so I was able in that cluster to allow 2 of the teachers in there to screen share and show kind of what pieces they were pushing into their Google Classrooms from different other platforms too. Whereas in my social studies and enrichment cluster, those were the ones who couldn't access email necessarily from home. So we had a much steeper learning curve. And so initially I was going to do a little separate mini cluster for them and try to help them get up and running. And then I realized we need like some intensive follow-up and support. So we sent out an email to the teachers asking for those who were considered themselves Google Classroom proficient and would be willing to help some of the other teachers. And then we looked at their Google Classrooms to see who had assignments that were at the critical attributes of what we were looking for. And we were able to pair up some of these teachers with some of the Google Classroom teachers and provide a one-on-one support with those teachers. And we have everybody up and running now on Google Classroom.
Yeah, that's awesome. Using other teachers as sort of those go first. And Amy, I think you have a similar story as well.
Yes, and so we're the same, a very similar situation like Natalie. Some of our older grades teachers are much more familiar with Google Classroom, whereas our K1 and 2 had never set up a Google Classroom before. They were not as familiar with how to record lessons, whereas some of our older grades teachers had already recorded lessons to use as differentiation in the classroom. And so we've been able to see a lot of conversation happen between teachers to help support one another with the use of the different technology.
Yeah, so just making sure that our teachers understand that this isn't just about what we talk to them about in that time that we're with them, but following up with them, keeping that story moving. And I know, Rhonda, you've been using Padlet. You mentioned it earlier, but just as a way to virtually keep track of what's happening in cluster and responding. You want to share just a little bit about this?
Yes, ma'am. So this was the platform that we were using during our regular clusters when we were face to face. So I always created a pattern at the end of our meetings. I had teachers to do like a quick reflection. And then of course that would help to drive what would happen for the next cluster. And although we are virtual, that has not changed. So I'm still using that format to figure out where are we going next, because we have to still make sure that whatever we're doing within the current platform is still addressing the needs of teachers and students. I don't, like you said, want it to be a checklist or people are conforming because they're required to be at cluster virtually for an hour a week or whatever. I want it to be something that is relevant to what they can do now and how they're going to return to school, like I said, eventually when we do ultimately return.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So the last tip that I want to share with you as you're thinking about transitioning to, virtual clusters is really about making sure that you're establishing norms or reestablishing norms as you dive into this new virtual modality. And one of the things that we talked about is just really, it makes sense to use really the same ones. That shouldn't change if we were saying, hey, we're going to make a commitment to start and end on time. We're going to make a commitment to have our materials. We're going to follow our agenda. So some of those norms that we originally used, we want to continue to use those same norms. Another norm that I think is important for us to think about is that right now during this, these uncharted waters, this unprecedented time, teachers can feel a lot of stress and frustration as they begin to maybe engage in their learning curve and thinking about moving to virtual classrooms. And so, during this time, you want to make sure that you're using that time for new learning and problem solving. So creating norms that give teachers an opportunity to express their stress or their frustration in other times and venues, it might allow you to use your time very productively. It also allows you to be there for them. Sometimes just having someone to listen to is important, but during that PLC or that cluster time, you have just a limited amount of time. I think it's also important that you help participants to plan to be virtually present, just as you would want them present in your actual cluster or professional learning community room. You want to make sure that they're actually virtually present as they engage in these virtual clusters. And so really monitoring their mics and cameras, making sure that they have cameras on, making sure that you can see their faces, making sure that there is a level of accountability so that everyone is learning and growing, and then also being able to answer questions and share with others. I think it's also important that depending on the platform that you choose, that you think about additional norms and expectations for some of the features, like the chat feature, or maybe the polling feature, or the whiteboard feature, or the screen sharing feature. Just making sure that you keep things positive, anticipating where things might get bogged down. I think it's always easy to establish those norms at the beginning. It's always harder to step in and establish them in the moment. And then I think this is something that we had talked about as a small group, and I just think it's so important. It's just establishing a check-in protocol to be sure everyone is okay. Where are you at in the beginning? Where are you at the end? And making sure that learning is happening and everyone feels good about where they're at. So I just think that it's important that you think about this as you transition to this new virtual modality, that you think about what might be some new norms that you have to establish. So we're getting close to the end of what things that we want to share today, as we know that all of you are going to be jumping into this transition, and many of you have already done that. Using those tips, I hope that you have some good maybe first start tips on what you might need to do. But I'd like to share something that I've often shared with teacher leaders as I work with them across many projects. And Randy Pausch was a professor at MIT, and he wrote a book called The Last Lecture. And he had a class he spoke about in one of his chapters, and it was a Building Virtual Worlds class. And he said that all of the students that would sign up for this class did not even want to think about making mistakes or failing. And so he kind of went on the premise that experience is what you get when you didn't get what you wanted. Basically, sometimes it's important to fail. And his students did not like the word fail. And so he used the analogy of a penguin. And basically, a penguin jumps into the water first. There's one penguin that will jump into the water first to make sure that the waters are safe for the other penguins. And so instead of calling it the first failure award, because none of his students wanted to receive that award, he called it the first penguin award. And basically, it's the concept of an award for glorious failure. And so I just want to encourage all of you out there. Sometimes it's important for us as teacher leaders to jump in the water, make sure everything's okay, and let our teachers recognize and see that we are going to be there to help them figure it out. And I just think this is a great analogy for all of us as we all jump into these uncharted waters trying to figure out. But there is no time like now for us as teacher leaders across the nation to be there for our teachers. And so leading clusters and leading professional development, whether it's in person and virtual, is so very important. So I want to thank all of you. I especially want to thank our master teachers, Natalie, Amy, and Rhonda, for being with us today. And good luck, and thank you so much.